Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I'm Dr. Swati Biswas from the Department of Islamic History and Culture, University of Calcutta. Today we are going to discuss from the paper Economic History of India, the module Mughal Empire, System of Agricultural Production. We have to understand that agriculture was the mainstay of the people and also the largest income drawer of the state. The mighty Mughal Empire expanded because of the tax system that prevailed then. The main aim of the state was to appropriate the surplus of the agrarian mass, and we also have to understand that this tax was collected in a regressive manner. Now, the tax was huge and could only be drawn from an agricultural system which works perfectly and improved with time. But of course, this did not mean that it improved also the status of the agriculturists. This mode of agriculture improved people who collected the tax was organized, but necessarily the status of the agriculturists did not perhaps improve. At least the sources does not confirm it. Now, in this module, our objective would be to see the general condition of agriculture that prevailed, the components of agriculture, that is the seeds, fertilizers, irrigations and the new crops, how that evolved, the development of horticulture and sericulture during this period, the yield of agriculture and peasant mobility, and the reason for dislocation of agriculture, if any. Now, initially, we have to understand that Mughal Empire was a vast geographical zone. Peasants cultivated their own land like anyone else in the contemporary world or contemporary Europe. The crops and climates differed. The Indian peasants used seed drill, which came to Europe much late. So we can understand technologically, India at that time was much ahead of Europe. In case of cultivating cotton, they used dibbling, which was not used in, say, Europe. India was far advanced than their European counterparts. The other advantage that the Indian peasants had was over the number of crops that was sown here. So it was not limited and it had a great market. And food crops or food grains were also exported by the merchants and the state together. Now, let's look into the components of agriculture. We have to understand that contemporary sources are very poor. There are very little information regarding the components, especially like fertilizers. The information regarding the fertilizers is inadequate, but we can understand that the coastal areas surely use fish bones as manure, because this was something that was done traditionally over a long time, and the Mughal period would not be any exception. The usefulness of some crops for preparing the soil was also known, if not throughout the empire, but in some parts it was done. So it was like between two big crop season, one crop would be sown in between to enhance the quality of the soil. The process of rotation of the crops was also high, and the use of it was there in many part. Now, regarding irrigation, this is also a feature which was entered the scenario much earlier in the agriculture. This would combat the rain and flood in excess. We have to understand India always has this irrational and erratic rainfall. So it is very important that the excess water be stored in some form or the other. The Mughal sources revealed that there were many devices to lift water from the well during the time, and it had regional differences depending on the soil. The regular common use was that of a wooden scoop or dhinkli. This worked on the lever principle and was used where the water was close to the surface region. So this would be incorporated in the wells which were not very deep. Now the second method was the charas. This was a leather bucket attached to a rope drawn by a pulley wheel by the oxen. Now this again also could not be used where the water level was deep down. The most sophisticated means of drawing water was a Persian wheel or the sakia. The sakia was made of wood, rope and earthen pots and worked on the principle of combination of pin drum gearing and belt. The gear wheel was rotated by draught animals going round in circles. Now this has been mentioned even by Babur in his account in much detail. In North India, wells were non-masonry types because they were cheap and easier to construct, and it could be even used by ordinary cultivators. So the process was either these wells were constructed by the village itself or a group of peasants, or maybe the headman took the initiative of building these non-masonry type of wells. These wells were dug in one season and then usually they were abandoned. The brick-line wells belong to the category of kohar or deep wells. Now the wells were large in number compared to the present day, since the surface water was much higher in these regions at that point of time. The need for deep well was not much, because it also would incur a lot of money. Now, makeshift arrangements suited the cost that could be incurred by the peasantry themselves, because in most areas the state did not take any responsibility of digging wells. In central India, Deccan and South India, tanks and reservoirs were widely used. This tradition was there much earlier to the Mughals. Now the concept of reservoirs and tanks in central India, Deccan and South India go back to the ancient times. The recent archaeological remains indicate that a massive reservoirs and huge sluice gates were attached to it. The best example of India's indigenous civil engineering can be envisaged at the Mughal lake built by the Vijayanagar rulers in the 15th and 16th century. It is a marvel in history. The peasants in the hilly tract peninsula also built reservoirs collectively. Dams in these regions were known as bunds. So what they would do is they would build a wall or a bank in certain parts and use the hills as the other edges, and would then stock the water. The area under irrigated cultivation is of course difficult to ascertain, but definitely the area was large. Now we know that even during the time of Delhi Sultanate, a large part of North India came under irrigational land. The state sometimes took much initiative in this respect, at least in those areas from which it incurred more money. The Upper Gangetic and of the Indian Valley regions canal was popular from the time of Delhi Sultanate, and we know that the Tughlaqs, especially Firoz Tughlaq, took special initiative to build these canals for particular crops like grapes. Most of the large canals were very impressive, and even compared to the time, Shah Jahan's Nahar-e-Faiz was exemplary, and it was about 115 miles in length. It took off from Yamuna River at its source in the hills, and then it went southwest and then moved up to southeast and met the Mother River again very close to Delhi, and it supplied water to the whole region, which was popular for at least 3 crops a season. The Mughal canal had some deficiencies. Most of the canals run above the surrounding plains, and thus the water could be obtained from them was limited for irrigation. Wells were more preferred during this time because of the cost. They were cost effective and could be easily built. From the account of Abul Fazl, it is noted that in the Suba of Lahore, wells were mentioned as a source of irrigation and not canals. So later the importance of canals in western Punjab of course rose. So we can understand the irrigation, the methods of irrigation differed from region to region. It depended on what kind of an economic zone that region would fall, whether and sometimes the peasants were in a position to build irrigational means, but sometimes they had to be supported by the state, and honestly the state support was very limited. Now let's move to the crops that were grown during this time. The essential feature of the agriculture during Mughal period was a huge amount of food and non-food crops that were grown by the peasants. We have to understand that the tax system was very high, and therefore the peasants had to give a lot to grow crops to meet this tax system. Aini Akbari gives a list of 16 types of rabi or spring crops that were grown in Suba Agra, and the state fetched revenue from all 16. He also mentioned 3 other crops which did not grow in this region. Now he also gives a list of about 25 autumn or kharif crops. He mentions 2 which were not grown in this area also. And estimates show that almost 41 types of crop grew in the region in 1 year alone. So the variety of the crops was an essential feature of this agricultural pattern. Abul Fazl, in his Aini Akbari, noted that in Suba Delhi 17 rabi crops and 26 kharif crops grew. Now all these informations were also used by the British during compiling their own report. Some of the crops of course grew in very small area, and the number of crops raised by an average peasant must have been very less, because we have to understand the holdings by smaller peasants were really very small. Even then, a khasra or revenue record in 1796 in the region of eastern Rajasthan revealed that during Kharif season, 9 out of 38 cultivators grew more than 5 crops on their land, while 11 of them cultivated 2 or 4 crops. So in a contemporary world, this is really very impressive. This of course did not include all the crops that was needed. Another feature of this agriculture was the introduction of sericulture. Sericulture improved a lot during this period. Sericulture was a revolutionary introduction in areas like Bengal. It was unknown in the 15th century. By 17th century, Bengal was one of the largest producers of silk in Asia, and it fetched a lot of money from outside. It was one of the important export goods of India. And Bengal silk was imported by remote places of Russia, Europe, and even most parts of Asia, of course. The quality of silk in this region was also noteworthy. This was not the rough silk that was found earlier. These are called the pure fine silks of Bengal. Now, during this time, during Mughal period, new crops were introduced in this land. New crops not only added the variety to the existing crop, but also fetched a lot of money. In the 17th century saw the introduction and expansion of two major crops like tobacco and maize, which came from the New World. The cultivation of tobacco in the subcontinent was remarkable. It was introduced in the western coast in 1600, but by 1650 it was cultivated in whole of Mughal India, and we know that in the 17th and 18th century consuming tobacco became a craze. Maize, it is believed to be confined in the region of Maharashtra and became popular in the rest of India shortly before the beginning of the 19th century. Though in eastern Rajasthan, maize was grown as a common crop. Jute was relatively less grown, but sun hemp was more in use and provided the needed fiber. Jute, of course, became popular in the early 19th century, and it was a crop that was much insisted by the British colonizers. In the 18th century, chili was introduced. Now, the introduction of chili as a crop, as an item, as a food item, revolutionized the Indian kitchen. This was an item for the first time which introduced in a common man's house, spiced the food. The quality of the food changed from this time. Chili, different types of chilies were grown, which are long chilies and round chilies, which were used by the rich. The production of it was less. The other common chilies, of course, had a huge market in India. In southern Maharashtra, coffee was introduced, but definitely tea was unknown in the Mughal world and came from China through the British. Potatoes and sweet potato was also later an addition and not very popular during the Mughals, of course. Now, another aspect of agriculture was horticulture. Now, horticulture also witnessed a change during this period. The technique of grafting was an area of interest of the elites. It is believed that the elites bought gardens where they insisted to have grafted fruit trees. Now, grafting, we have to understand, involved a lot of money, a lot of patience, and quality soil. But that the elites had the capacity, or rather they reused the surplus that they were taking from the common man. The process of grafting was very much used for the growth of citrus fruits. This process led to the growth of cherry in Kashmir later. Three new fruits were introduced to the subcontinent from the New World, namely pineapple, papaya, and cashew nuts. Even it is believed that guava came to this land in the hands of the peasants through the New World. Now, let's discuss who were the participants of this participants in this agricultural process. Now, another interesting feature of this agriculture was peasant mobility. Interestingly, in the medieval world, mobility of the peasants was a common feature. As the crops were rain-fed in India, the peasants could settle anywhere they could. And land was, we have to understand, also available during this time. The shortage of land did not appear at this point of time. This mobility was possible since even during Mughal period, we can understand that virgin land beyond the Doab or in the remote areas of India was available. And it is believed that the system encouraged this mobility because the peasants always were looking for more and more land that they could use for agriculture. Now, At least this is true for 16th and 17th century. The crisis of the land that we have seen during the British period actually starts from the high 18th century. The term Pahikasht indicates those peasants who cultivated in the land which was not their own. But then this term Pahikasht has an ambiguity, whether these people were wage laborers or whether they only cultivated in the land that they cleared or they cultivated in the land of the others on some kind of a contract is not known, but of course they were peasants who were mobile. Now let's look into the agricultural production. It is important to discuss the yield of the crops. We have to understand the information regarding the yield of the crop is very limited. Abul Fazl to some extent gives us an idea about the yield of crop, and of course there was a concept of good, bad and middling lands as worked out in Sher Shah's account in 1540-45, which was later used by Abul Fazl to indicate the kind of yield that the crops had. A comparison of the dasturs, that in cash revenue rates of late 16th century with that of 19th century indicates this sugarcane in the area of western Uttar Pradesh shows that relative to wheat, the value of the output of sugarcane remained the same and fell by more than a quarter in the third. So these fluctuations were always there. In the same way, the value of the output of cotton and indigo in all likelihood declined during this period. It is certain that the yield of food grains remained same for 2 centuries. The yield of sugarcane definitely rose and that of indigo remained almost the same. Now, these are all indicated in the records that we can collect from this time. Of course, there is no other way to verify these records. The range of cotton is not known. There has not been much change, though it may seem that during the Mughal period only the best land was put under cultivation, but surely that was not the trend in the 19th century. So therefore in the 19th century any land could be grabbed for cash crop production. The productivity per head was definitely higher compared if you compared between 16th century, 19th century or even for that matter early 20th century. The availability of land was greater during Mughal period, so therefore the per capita yield would be more. By the time it was 1900, the land holding reached optimum level. Though it can be assumed that the larger average holding would require a greater number of cattle. The large number of cattle would then reflect larger quantity of milk products. So these are the inferences that one can draw from the reports, or rather the informations that from the contemporary accounts. The caste divided society of India did not allow large holdings to lower caste people, and there was a huge difference in the size of the land holdings within the same village. The landholders or mukaddams practiced khudkasht, by which they employed wage laborers in their field. The wage was perhaps in cash or kind, but again that differed as per the region. At the opposite end, there were small peasants or the rezaria who depended wholly upon borrowing for their subsistence and also for the seed and the cattle. They also have to be considered as part of the peasantry. The difference in the pattern of landholding surely had implications for the cultivation of different crops. The cash crop like cotton, sugarcane, indigo, betel leaf and opium involved frequent ploughing and watering. Thus, these demanded large investment. The return of these crops again were much higher than the food crops, but we have to understand that they would also incur more and more investment, which was not possible for the lower rung of the peasantry. The regional distribution of food grain have not much changed. The cash crop grown in the area have changed due to the presence of railways in the 19th century. The contemporary accounts suggest that India produced huge amount of indigo and silk during the Mughal period. The extensive long-distance overland trade of silk, cotton and opium definitely depended on the huge production in the country. The size of agricultural production and the impressive per capita income does not mean that agricultural activity run very smoothly, and it, of course, as we have discussed, was very, very region-based. The natural and man-made disruptions were serious interruptions, and the violent setbacks of the agricultural world was a very, very common feature. Now, why did the concept of dislocation of agriculture happen? One is the untimely rain that has been a matter of concern in the agrarian life. The policy of the empires, even of the Delhi Sultanate and the Mughals, did not have a very, very smooth, clear agricultural policy where the state would intervene in any kind of natural calamity. They only intervened when their income shrunk. The famines would create havoc in the villages by diminishing population to dismal number. The second factor that posed immense dislocation was the agrarian exploitation. The surplus was almost squeezed through the new tax system. Now, the revenue increased comparatively, but this again does not indicate production increase or extension of agriculture, but it was rather an indication of price rise. So the amount of surplus that was squeezed through the tax system was a burden on the peasant community. Added to it, the local leaders added the cesses. So the peasantry was always under the subsistence level. So this sometimes became so harsh that they removed themselves, or they rather ran away from the villages, and that would amount to this dislocation of agriculture. So therefore, in this module, we have discussed the different components of agriculture and the people who were involved in this agriculture. And let us summarize as to what we have discussed in this module. The agrarian production of Mughal period show massive change from the earlier period. The technological development of the earlier period was fully utilized. The massive structure of the empire gave impetus to the growth of the agrarian production. The new crops and changed revenue system was a massive change, of course. What did not change was the traditional relation in the agrarian setup, and thus the exploitation of the peasantry of the state and the caste system became a hindrance to the massive growth of agriculture and general well-being of the agriculturists. Thank you for your patience listening, and you can go back to the e-text for further references. Thank you.